Lecture 16 for Western Civ 1. The Carolingian Contributions to Western Civilization. As we begin today, as a devotional thought, I'd lead you to 1 Peter. There in 1 Peter chapter 2, picking up in verse 11, we find that Peter, writing to Christians, says, "Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from evil desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king, as supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong, and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you are called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in His steps." The example of Jesus is certainly one that we have before us as Christians, and as we talk about this time period of the Carolingians in France, what we'll find is that they didn't always follow the example of Jesus in doing good, in resisting and abstaining from the desires of this world. They certainly would like some of the second part of that passage, where there's the call for people to submit to kings, but as far as following the example of Christ, we'll find that oftentimes people were challenged in this time period, even as we're challenged in our time period. We want to follow Christ and have Him as our example, to follow in His steps, to be humble, to do good, to obey God, and to serve others, to endure unjust punishment. And what we find is that Jesus bore our sins in His body on the cross, so that we could die to sins, have victory over sins, and live for righteousness as His Spirit dwells within us. And we've been healed by what Jesus Christ has done. And He is the example that we want to keep before us, and we don't want to be too terribly distracted by other examples. We'll find that there's some things we can learn from the Carolingians, some things that they contribute to Western civilization, but they're no substitute for the Savior that we have in Jesus Christ. Charlemagne's going to be known as the Great, but he didn't change things for people for eternity like Jesus Christ. Well, as we begin today, we want to talk about the emergence of the Carolingians in Frankland, area of Germanic peoples that have come within the Roman Empire. And so we're looking at the area primarily of what we call today France in Western Europe. And certainly the Roman Empire had extended through this area of Gaul and up into Germany amongst the various people groups, or even beyond the Rhine River. And Christianity had spread in this area. And it's a time period here as we move towards the 8th century where there's going to be a slight warming trend after a couple of centuries of cold and irregular weather. There'll be something of a environmental improvement, a warming trend, which is going to promote greater crop yields. And with greater crop yields, there can be greater specialization, as fewer people have to be working the land. There's more calories. People are going to be healthier, grow stronger, live longer, be able to live in urban centers. These are all going to be positive things for the Carolingians. So where is this family of Carolingians come from? And what in the world is a Carolingian? Well, the name Carolingian comes from the name Charles or Carl, to use the Roman equivalent, and are particularly identified with the family of Charles the Great, or Karl de Gross if you want to do things German. So where did this family emerge? Well, they emerge from the Frankish clan of Pepinids, and the Pepinids were great warriors who served the Merovingians. We've talked before about Clovis, the Frankish ruler who had united the Franks and had converted to Christianity. What happens is the Merovingians move towards using other nobles to fight their battles for them. This is going to sometimes give them the negative characterization as the do-nothing Merovingian kings. And this is going to be something that makes them vulnerable as they don't go off to war, and they send mayors of the palace to do that for them. The Pepinids under Pepin I are going to become mayors of the palace. They're going to serve as the generals of the Merovingian monarchs. And they're going to do the dirty work for them. And they're going to grow in power. Giving his name to those who follow as one that would be highly regarded, we have a Charles, the son of Pepin, who inherits the position of mayor of the palace, and he defended the Merovingians and their interests, the interests of the Frankish people, as we have the invasion of the Muslims up into the Iberian Peninsula and beyond the Pyrenees Mountains into Frank land. And Charles, who gets the nickname Martel, which means the hammer, Charles Martel is going to defeat the Islamic forces at a battle between the towns of Poitiers and Tours. And generally today this is known as the Battle of Poitiers. It looks Poitiers. But Charles Martel, who's going to serve as the mayor of the palace, has a long tenure as he serves from 714 until 741. And he's a powerful individual. He didn't just win the first battle there at Tours against the Muslims, but subsequent efforts by the Muslims to invade. An important and strategic tool that comes to be more clearly utilized at this point in time is the use of the stirrup. Now, the Muslims had cavalry forces, but the advantage of having stirrups is that you have a stable weapons launching platform from the back of the steed that's carrying you into battle. And as you're up above the rest of the fighters, there's again the advantage of gravity as you're able to swing your weapons from above. And the stirrup is going to be a particularly important transition that's made that's going to transform warfare in subsequent time periods in Europe. So Charles Martel is going to defeat the Muslims. Sometimes they're known as the Saracens, and this is going to elevate the family's prestige even further. Now, it won't just be against the Muslims that he will be successful. He'll also have victories against the Bavarians in South Germany as we'd know it today. And so he's a great war figure, an impressive figure. His grandson, who is going to take the position of mayor of the palace subsequently, isn't quite such an imposing figure. He has the name Pepin the Short. So in comparison to his predecessors, he's comparatively short. And he's going to rule as mayor of the palace from 741 until the year 751. So for a 10-year position, he's going to take this inherited position of being the commander of the Frankish forces, leading the Frankish warriors into battle. But he serves as a person who's defending Chilperic III, the last of the Merovingian monarchs. The Merovingians have had success in providing heirs for some time, but Chilperic is a minor, and as such, Pepin doesn't want just the power, he also wants to have the title, and so Chilperic is going to be eventually here forced to go off and live the rest of his life in a monastery, where he won't live that terribly long, and the warriors of the Franks will elect Pepin the Short to be their king, and he'll be anointed by Pope Zacharias. And this is going to be part of the beginnings of Carolingian kingship. Like Germanic people before, they're successful in battle. That's a critical thing for the Germanic folks. But Pepin the Short After 10 years of serving as mayor of the palace, from 751 until 768, he's going to serve as king of the Franks. This comes about as a result of a Franco-Papal alliance. The Lombards, who dominated much of Italy, certainly challenged papal authority, and Pope Zacharias had troubles, and so as a result, he's going to be looking towards Pepin for help. At this point in time, the popes in Rome didn't get a lot of help from the Byzantines as they asked them for help, because the people in the West continued to use icons, whereas at this point in time, the Byzantines were ruled over by iconoclasts who were rejecting the use of icons. So the popes in Rome, the bishops of Rome, are looking for someone to help them in their claim to authority, and Pope Zacharias, first of all, followed by Pope Stephen, will be looking towards Pepin the Short as somebody who would be a strong person who could assist them against their enemies. And so there's going to be a reciprocal support that comes from popes to Pepin the Short. And so he's going to be anointed as King of the Franks by Pope Zacharias, and then subsequently under Pope Stephen II, he would be anointed as the father of the Romans. Now, he's not called the King of the Romans; he's the King of the Franks, but he's the father of the Romans. So he's the person who is looking after Rome, who's protecting Rome. And so Pepin is ruling as king in his own right, anointed like priests by the Bishop of Rome. Pepin the Short has two heirs in the persons of Charlemagne and his brother Carloman. And this has the potential for problems. But Charlemagne, as he comes to the throne, is going to eventually rule from the year 768, when Pepin dies, all the way up until 814. So he has a very, very long reign. When it comes to the Carolingians, and particularly Charlemagne, there's a number of important sources. Two sources that I'd have you know about would be first Einhard, and then secondly Notker the Stammerer. They have some interesting nicknames that they tie to these folks. But Einhard's going to write a biography of Charlemagne that takes as its inspiration classical texts that had written about Augustus. And so they're going to try to show Charlemagne as being something like the great Roman emperors who went before. As we study these sources and learn about Charlemagne personally, what we find is that this son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada is born to a family that professes Christianity, and in the year 754, just 3 years after his father had been recognized as king of the Franks, the Pope, this again would be Pope Zacharias, anointed Charlemagne and his brother as being heirs. So the two brothers, following Germanic custom, are both going to be heirs of their father. And so when their father dies, they inherit the realm. Now, for the first 3 years, there's some small rivalries with his brother Carloman, who will eventually retire to a monastery in the year 771. This leaves Charlemagne to be the singular ruler of this territory. Personally, he was a large man. Sort of like King Saul of old, he stood head and shoulders above the typical Frank. That would certainly give him some advantage in battle, as he had greater reach. And he's a physically strong person, and in the study of his bones in relatively modern times, people calculated from the length of his long bones that he would have been somewhere around 6'4" in height. So he was a tall man, a robust physical specimen, and a great warrior, trained to go to war and effective in battle. What we're going to find is that this is going to be an area that he's going to build upon. He looks like a Frankish warlord, and he's going to be successful as such. Somebody who advised him as he embarks in his long tenure is going to be Alcuin of York. And the advice of Alcuin of York was that he should be humble to Christians, feared by pagans, loved by the poor, and certainly he would be somebody who could be and should be feared by his enemies. He was strong against his enemies, and what we find is that he defeated the king of the Lombards in the year 771, and he forced the Lombard king, King Desiderius, to retire to a monastery, and took his iron crown and crowned himself. So he was at one and the same time king of the Franks and now king of the Lombards. This is something that he did for himself. Now remember, he was anointed as king and heir of Pepin by the Pope at an earlier time, but as far as being the king of the Lombards, he claims to have done that himself. Moving a little bit to the north into Germany, we're going to find that he's going to capture Bavaria in 778, and he's going to deal with a long-term problem with the nomadic Avars in the year 796. So he's going to settle them down in the east, and no longer will people be worrying about the predation of these people who are moving into the territory. He will have a long-term battle in northern Europe against the Saxons, a 30-year war, and during that war, what we're going to find is that sometimes he's quite ruthless, on single days sometimes executing as many as 4,000 Saxon prisoners of war in one day. But what we'll also see is that he will oftentimes spare people who convert to Christianity, and he's going to promote the baptism of the Saxons. They're under some duress. He's going to expand Roman territory also in the area that we know today as Austria. This would be the Ostmark, the Eastern March, the area of disputed lands, and so he's expanding territory dramatically towards the north and the east. He's not as successful moving across the Pyrenees into Spain. He aspires to do this, and part of this is because the Umayyad rulers of the Iberian Peninsula were somewhat divided amongst themselves, and so he'd send a relative by the name of Roland in the year 778, and he would be successful eventually in conquering Barcelona, but his relative Roland would be killed in battle. So he's never going to expand successfully against the Umayyad rulers of Spain. As far as expansion into Italy, he's certainly defeated the Lombards, and he's going to take the territories of Venetia, and which had been dominated by the Byzantines, and down the Adriatic coast into Dalmatia. And so the Byzantines are going to lose some territory to him as some of these areas become tributary to Charlemagne. Like his father, he'll continue to have an alliance with the Pope, and Pope Leo III, who ruled from 795 until 618, found himself needing help. The local inhabitants of Rome were unhappy with him and were threatening his physical well-being, and so he appealed to Charlemagne for help. And Charlemagne responded, and as a result, in the year 800, Charlemagne went to church on Christmas Day. Supposedly, according to Einhard, Pope Leo surprised him by crowning him Roman Emperor. This is going to be the beginnings of the position of Holy Roman Emperor, but there's some tensions that came with this. He had crowned himself the King of the Lombards, but Pope Leo III, by crowning him Emperor, in a way makes himself an Emperor Maker. And this is going to set up a long-term tension between the kings of the Franks and the Roman emperors in particular, and popes. Who has greater authority? Authority in the church is one thing, but authority in matters of politics will be another. Charlemagne is very successful in battle. His warriors appreciate what he does, and he's able to win them the rewards of battle, namely a lot of plunder and also additional territory that he can assign to his victorious warlords. In his administration of this growing territory, Charlemagne followed some practices of the earlier Merovingian as he began. Namely, he had a traveling court. And so he'd go around to local urban centers, which would be ruled by a local count, and would live with them for a few weeks, and then he'd move on to another city and stay with another count. And this way he could make sure that there was accountability and that his rules were being observed, and this way his court could be sustained. Eventually, as we come towards the later part of his reign, what we'll find is that he will aspire to restore things Roman and will build a capital at Aachen. That's the German name for the French place Aix-la-Chapelle. And what we're going to find there is that he's going to establish a court, a fixed court. Now he's able to do this as Aachen is located strategically amongst the great rivers of Europe, and it's towards the north, but he's able to entrust the southern part of Frank land to his son, and so Louis, his son, will become the king of the Franks and will rule the area up towards the south. But he's going to maintain his control through sending out regular capitularies. These are standard proclamations that are written down. Again, it's not something that's codified like the laws of Justinian, but he sends out capitularies, his decrees, amongst his warlords and these people who are called dukes. A duke is a person who might be over a number of counties, a number of cities, and he's something more of a regional warlord, and it was a name that came out of the Roman Empire. But as he sent out his capitularies, he sent them by way of the missi dominici, the messengers of the king. These are pairs of itinerant royal legates. One would be a cleric, and the second one would be a warrior, who basically helped to keep the counts in line. So when he gets to be able to be sedentary and maintain a fixed court and to build a palace at Aachen, and is no longer traveling, he's collecting enough taxes and the like so that he can have that kind of fixed capital there in the north where he's fighting against the Saxons. He's going to be able to maintain control through his representatives. And if somebody would not obey one of his capitularies, then they could anticipate that Charlemagne would pitch up with his warriors to do what German folks like to do, and that was namely to defeat their enemies and seize plunder. And so he's going to be a very powerful character who, like Frankish warlords before him, didn't put up with any dissent, and we're going to find that he's going to be increasingly effective in his administration, and one of the things that promotes this is the patronage that he adopts, cultural patronage. Particularly this is seen in his promotion of literacy through his palace school. This is the chief intellectual center that stimulated scholarly thought. It was something that would be led by the best scholars that he could draw to his palace school. The leading figure was Alcuin of York. He had been an advisor to Charlemagne. Now Charlemagne himself has worked to read, but he's not a terribly adroit person at writing, and yet he values writing and its uses, and so he seeks to cultivate scholarship through his palace school. And this palace school particularly cultivated the 7 liberal arts. Alcuin of York helps to build this curriculum. It was made up of what's known as the trivium. Not that these things are trivial, but they are the beginning things, and this is something of our origin of our word trivial, but the trivium included grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the thought was that once you have these three subjects mastered, then you could go on to the quadrivium. So the trivium are three roads to truth. You see the word tri and via in that trivia. These are the three routes towards truth. And within rhetoric, a number of things would be studied. Such things even as history were included in the study of rhetoric. But as they moved on to the quadrivium, this is the upper level studies. This would include studies of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So these made up the 7 basic subjects which were promoted in the palace school. Now, under a charter, a capitulary of the year 787, this is sometimes known as the Charter of Modern Thought, he promotes cathedral schools. So in every city, counts should establish a cathedral school. If they have a bishop, then you have a cathedral school. And this would be something that would be repeated in the year 789 and in 805. And these cathedral schools, the goal was to help provide literate clergy and to educate boys of leaders so that they could read capitularies and communicate within the empire of Charlemagne. In the palace school, something was developed which would help to preserve a whole lot of classical literature, and that would be the use of Carolingian minuscule. This is an efficient style of orthography that accelerated the production of manuscripts at this time period. So, as a result, even today, there are some 8,000 biblical manuscripts that employ this particular script. Carolingian minuscule has a fairly small, rounded script with limited ligatures. What this means is that as you draw these small Latin alphabet shapes, they're sort of rounded and they flow one to another rather easily. They're very distinct letters, and this was much, much faster to write than the old uncial scripts, which had been adopted for Latin before, where you're writing all in capital letters. In Carolingian minuscule, you can discern when a sentence begins because it begins with the capital letters. So they have capital letters to begin sentences, and at the end of a sentence they would start to use the convention of punctuation. So you have a period. You have a space between words. Prior to this, many Latin manuscripts didn't have spaces between words. So with Carolingian minuscule, you can distinctly see what the words are. It will facilitate reading and also understanding of these texts. And so this is going to multiply the number of texts that are made, and many classical texts that we have preserved are preserved for us today in Carolingian period and style manuscripts. Amongst the things that are going to be written are going to be everyday edicts sent out to the counts, but also liturgical writings, classical writings that are going to be copied. They're able to do this because there is the ability to fund people working in scriptoria within monasteries, doing this sort of thing, or in these cathedral schools or the palace school there at Aachen. This was something of a change, as there's some things the Romans had done that are consciously being restored by Charlemagne. This is why this is sometimes called the period of the Carolingian Renaissance. There's a lot of things that the Romans did that he's able to do once again because there's a level of peace and prosperity that he's able to maintain within his territory. Now, it comes oftentimes at the expense of those people on his frontiers, but there's a lot of things that are going to be brought back from earlier times. Oftentimes they will, however, have a Germanic flavor to them. Following the example of other Caesar Papus, he takes up religious leadership. And so he sees as part of his duty to reform the Frankish clergy. Now, the mayors of the palace, Charles Martel and subsequently Pepin and then Charlemagne, all cooperated with the Roman Church and had promoted the missionary activities of the English monk Boniface amongst the Germans. But what they see is a need to reform Frankish clergy. There have been a lot of local things that had developed in the midst of all the tumult and some doctrinal variations, local customs that had evolved, and they saw a need to standardize the liturgy, and they particularly Charlemagne particularly admired things going on in Rome as he had traveled there, and so he's going to promote a certain amount of liturgical reform. And what will happen is that they'll move to clearly using Latin in their liturgy, and yet at the same time they still embrace some local Galician items into their liturgy, but they're going to develop a liturgical year and certain rites like what they would do in burying people that have something of a local character. In their worship services, since he admires things Roman particularly, we'll find that Gregorian chant from Rome will be embraced amongst the Franks. As far as doctrine goes, like the popes who supported him, Charlemagne rejected iconoclasm, and so we'll see the continued use of sculpture in churches, sometimes for didactic types of things, and we'll find that there will continue to be the use of religious sculpture here in the West. As far as artwork goes, something that's promoted amongst the copying of all these manuscripts is going to be illuminated manuscripts where they're decorating gospel texts and other works, but it won't just be the texts themselves that are objects of art. We'll find even the covers of these books are sometimes going to be encrusted with jewels, and they become an art object in and of themselves. Just the bindings themselves are so-called treasure bindings on valuable books are an expression of their devotion to particularly biblical texts. In some areas, what we're going to find is that there's going to be some involvement with doctrinal questions, and something that's going to grow out of the Carolingians is going to be increased focus on Mary. And overall, though, Charlemagne wanted to create the impression that he was more than just some other Germanic warlord. This is seen even in the church at Aachen, as his palace is connected by a second-floor walkway, and he could appear on the second floor above the worshippers down below, and his throne was elevated against the windows, so you could see him only in silhouette. He was definitely in a power position up above everybody else, and so he's projecting this idea that somehow he's something above the average person. As far as in his life, we find that we wouldn't put him necessarily in the category of being a Catholic saint, although he's going to be the subject of this type of veneration. He is a person who used violence to force conversion amongst the Saxons that he defeated. He is ruthless in crushing those who would rebel against him. But what he succeeded in doing is creating an empire that's going to be bigger than any empire until the time of Napoleon in Europe. When Charlemagne died, he'd outlived a number of his sons. He'd had a number of wives along the way, and he's certainly going to promote the idea of marriage as being a sacrament in the Latin, in the Western-speaking church. But he himself had had a number of wives and mistresses along the way, but he'd outlived all of his sons except Louis the Pious. All of his legitimate sons, other than Louis, who gets the nickname the Pious, will be outlived by Charlemagne. So when Charlemagne dies in the year 814, his son Louis inherits the whole empire. And Louis is going to rule up until the year 840. As far as wanting sources on Louis, you look particularly at the writings of a monk by the name of Nithard. What we find is that from the very beginning of Louis's reign, there are challenges. There begin to be reports of invaders on his northern frontier. These are more Germanic people from further north. We'll later on know them as the Vikings, who are pressing southward. Louis had been raised by clerics along the way, had been trained, he was a literate person, and he recognized the authority of the church in his life. And as a result, in the year 822, when he was at odds with the church, he was forced by the church to do penance. And he's recognized as being somebody who worked in harmony with the church. He worked particularly as a servant of the church. He was, however, a successful warlord, and one of the problems he had, though, would be sons who aspired to leadership as he got to be older. He did succeed in keeping Frankland unified, but on his death, there was a problem afoot. What he aspired to do was to have a unified realm with his sons being kings within that realm, and yet when he died, there was civil war amongst his three older surviving sons. And there's going to be this 3-year civil war, which is, again, civil wars are always painfully expensive for the people who are fighting them, the people that are living in those lands, but what it comes out of this is something known as the Treaty of Verdun. It's signed in the year 843, and under this treaty, the three sons agree to the nominal submission to their older brother, Lothair, and so they're going to be submissive to him as king of the Romans, but they're each going to be kings of their own territories. So we want to consider Lothair here first of all. Lothair, who had been born back in 795, came to the throne, so that would be back at the time of Charlemagne, his grandfather. He had lived out his boyhood during his grandfather's life. He'd seen how things had been then. But he comes to the throne in 843, and he's going to live until 855. Okay, so he's going to live to be 60 years old. But Lothair, as the oldest surviving son, gets what's known as the Middle Kingdom. This would include Charlemagne's capital at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, and would stretch all the way there from the area by the English Channel and down through Europe, through Switzerland, down into Italy, and so he would be the ruler here of this territory, the Middle Kingdom. This would also be known as Lothari Regnum, the realm of Lothar. And his brothers are supposed to be subject to him, but they want to act independently. He's going to have the title Roman Emperor. The problem will be, when Lothair dies, his three sons who succeed him split the territory up. And so you have Lothair II, who's going to take the territory towards the north. You have Louis II, who takes central territory in Burgundy, and then you have Charles, who takes Italy. So what happens is that following Germanic succession traditions, his three heirs each get a third of the empire. That would be the Middle Kingdom. And the problem is that means that they're vulnerable, as now that large territory has been broken 3 ways, and they have uncles who are controlling territories to the north and to the south that control more territory and thereby more warriors, and who aspire to some of these territories. Subsequently, when those 3 successors would have children, they would split their territories into smaller pieces. So very quickly, the Middle Kingdom becomes vulnerable to the predations of the older uncles, the other sons of Louis the Pious. So Lothair is the heir, and he has the Middle Kingdom. According to the Treaty of Verdun, a very interesting treaty, what's interesting is that it's written in Latin, but it also has additions that are in French, in Frankish, and in German, Deutsch. This is because you have Lothair, who's going to continue to hold the title of being emperor, but his brother Charles the Bald is going to rule over Frankland in the west and south, and the brother Louis, who has the nickname Louis the German, is going to control the territory to the north and east. And so Charlemagne's great empire is divided up 3 ways, And we're going to find that the remnants of his dynasty will continue on for some time. In western part of Frankland, the territory ruled by Charles the German, by Charles the Bald, he's going to have a number of heirs that continue on. Some of them don't have very impressive nicknames, so you have Louis the Stammerer, who dies in 879, and eventually Charles the Simple, who dies in 927. But in the year 987, the last of the Carolingian heirs dies off, and the French counts will elect a person that they think is weak and vulnerable, a man from the Capetian family, Hugh Capet, and Hugh Capet will start the next dynasty of French rulers. And his family is going to be around ruling for a very, very long time. Direct heirs will rule up until the 14th century. Then there's going to be some dynastic problems. So we're going to have about 4 centuries of successful passage of the throne amongst members of the family of Hugh Capet, and then they'll have to move to some auxiliary lines as we look at the Valois and the Bourbon families within the Capetian line, who will become the subsequent rulers of Frankland. So, as we analyze what happens to the Carolingian Empire, we see that the Carolingian Empire is going to collapse. Why does it collapse? Well, there are internal problems. One is the problem of the Germanic system of succession, where sons inherit their father's territory and divide it up amongst them. This divided the power base and was also a source of conflict. How do you get more territory? Well, by fighting against others and seizing their territory. And so these people who are essentially family members are going to be at odds with each other, seeking territory from one another. And so there's going to be ongoing conflicts. This is a problem when, following Germanic tradition, warlords maintain the loyalty of their warriors by having success. And the problem is that even during the time of Charlemagne, the expansion of his territory was pretty well finished by the year 804. And so there's no new territory being added. And so this is going to make some warlords unhappy, and there's going to be the potential for civil war to take place. In the system of Germanic succession, what we find is loyalty is very personal, and we're going to find that there's interesting personalities that are involved here. Some individuals look like great warriors, others are going to be weak and be vulnerable to disloyalty breaking out. As we look at the Carolingian Empire, we find that it was a very large territory, but they had a problem with geography. It's such a large territory, they didn't have autobahns to carry people or railways to carry people from one place to another. And the territory was divided up by mountains. Particularly the Alps would be a great obstacle in the midst of all this. In maintaining unity, they also have the problem of language, whereas the church that they have is going to continue to use Latin. That's something that they promote, and correspondence can go on in Latin, but yet common people don't understand what's going on in church, or if there's imperial decrees, royal decrees, if they're in Latin, well, do you understand them? Can you read them? So language will be a problem, and this is what helps to divide this territory between the Franks and the Germans. Besides these internal problems, there are also some external problems. You have invasions by the Saracens. This would be the Muslims coming particularly from North Africa to the coast of Europe, particularly in Sicily in the year 825, and also attacking Rome in the year 843, landing along the coastline of France. And so you've got to fight to protect territory that you already think of as being yours. Another invader coming from the northeast would be the Magyars. The Magyars are a nomadic people group that are motivated to come westward by the pressure of the Turkish Khazars in the year 864, and so as a result they migrate westward and disrupt society within the eastern parts of Frankland. Their movements will even reach as far as Rome by the year 937. These invasions of the Magyars, as they wander around, are really hard to deal with. If you're growing crops and planning to eat those, but yet somebody comes along and eats them for you, then your family's going to starve, and it is going to depend upon Otto the first of the Salian emperors, to defeat the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in the year 955, and this is going to lead to the assumption of the family of Otto to become the Salian emperors, the Holy Roman emperors from this particular dynasty, who are going to be around for an extended period of time. Very interesting, the Salian emperors will continue to use the palace at Aachen as their location for anointing and coronating their heirs. The third and most devastating problem would come from the north. Again, the Magyars were eventually settled into the area known as Hungary today and converted to Christianity, but the Vikings coming from the north would be the source of a great social disruption that the Carolingians are going to struggle against, and we're going to talk about the Vikings here in a subsequent lecture. The consequences of the Carolingians' collapse would be that popes would grow in their claim to power, and we're going to find that they can force people like Louis the Pious to do penance. Lothair II, who wanted to divorce his wife, will be forced to keep his wife by a pope. But the popes had their own problems too. While they might exert themselves over Frankish rulers, without having a really strong protector, they were vulnerable to invasions and attack. And so there will be a growing tension between the church and these military champions for power. There's going to be vulnerability of Europe to invasion. But as we think about the Carolingians' contributions to Western civilization, what we find is that they've done some very important things. Particularly in promoting Carolingian minuscule, they're going to preserve literary culture. In the area of politics, they're going to establish the political foundations of Europe. In the areas of religion, particularly, they're going to promote marriage as being a sacred act, and they're going to promote monogamy, and this is going to have an impact on family life. In the area of architecture, they copy a lot of things Roman, but something they bring to church architecture. Again, they've copied a lot of things from the Byzantines and the Romans, and they use a lot of spoils, lots of fragments from earlier buildings in their structures. But something that they move towards having is a very extensive westwork to cathedrals, to churches. This would be particularly the entrance area on the western side of the church. And this will become a characteristic of medieval cathedrals, where you have very impressive entryways on the west side of the church with tall towers and ornate doors. And they're going to be copied for a long, long time. As we think about the Carolingians, they've helped preserve a lot of things Roman. They've revived some things, and they've promoted prosperity. They promote the use of coinage, as Charlemagne and his heirs had used coins. They actually established a system of coinage that's going to be used for a long time, in that you have a pound of silver, which they divided into 20 solidi, and each solidi was divided into 12 denarii, or a dinar. Again, this is a term that comes out of the Arabic world, but a dinar is basically a Arabization of the word denarius. Sometimes it gets translated as a penny, a day's wage. And so as a result, you have 240, again, you have 20 solidi, and then you have 12 dinars to the solidi, and so you have 240 dinars to the pound. So a pound of silver is basically broken up into coins, and a coin made of silver would be 1/240th of a pound of silver. So you get 240 to the pound. This will be carried on in English coinage up until fairly recent times, where you have 20 shillings to the pound and 12 pence to the shilling. So they have 240 pence to the pound. This will be something that continues on in Western civilization. The Carolingians have an impact on Western civilization that has an impact for years to come.